Good morning, everybody. I am Piercarlo Padoan. I'm the chairman of UniCredit, but I'm also affiliated, for a long time, I've been affiliated to the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and I now speak on behalf of both. First of all, thanks for coming. It's a great opportunity to be here and exchange views at such a crucial point. And from my perspective, it is extremely important that important debates are carried out about transition issues. The bank I have been serving for a number of years now prouds itself of being a pan-European bank. UniCredit is active in 13 countries and expanding its activities. And it's also very much engaged in climate financing with all the perspectives that a lender can have, but also with a very positive attitude. I just want to spend a few seconds left just to highlight one point. I am every day more and more convinced that on transition, Europe, but not just Europe, continents, Africa, the United States, America, North America and South America, Asia, the whole world are playing a key historical challenge. That is to say, how to make transition not just one additional element in the policy agenda, but the key driver of dealing with this multi-crisis environment, which, let's not forget, is still with us, both in terms of security being threatened and in terms of economic opportunities being foregone, and most of all because of the high price in terms of human lives that the situation generates. So transition must be something that involves all the stakeholders and shareholders. I speak for the financial community, but I also speak as a European citizen. We all need to adjust our preferences, our policy strategies in order to achieve a common goal, which is sustainable growth in multiple meanings: economic, social, environmental. And therefore, I'm more than convinced that events like yours today will be an addition to the achievement of this goal. Thanks very much, and have a very fruitful working day. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Piercarlo, and thanks to UniCredit indeed for hosting us here today. So a very warm welcome on behalf of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. It's a real pleasure to actually welcome you here again, because this is not the first Nexus25 event that we hold here in UniCredit. And this event, with the cooperation of the European Think Tanks Group, which is a network of European think tanks working on specifically development issues, that IAI is part. So again, thank you to ETTG, and of course, with the support of Stiftung Mercator, without which none of this would be possible. So very, very warm thank you on behalf of, I think, myself and all of us, to all of our partners. So we have been into this Nexus business really for quite some time, and now in just a few moments, Michael Wirtz will say a few more words about Nexus25, the Nexus25 project. Just a few words on behalf of myself in terms of what is the purpose of this particular meeting today. It is quite clear that on the one hand, both the European Union and Africa are really entering a new phase in their transition. On the one hand, Africa has put out its Nairobi Declaration, which really sort of provides a vision and a pathway in order to achieve its transition and sustainable development. On the other hand, the European Union, which really spent the previous 5 years with its European Green Deal in really upping the ante in terms of what its own climate ambitions are. And now as it enters and really presses the accelerator in terms of the implementation of those objectives, it is inevitably also going to be doubling down on how it intends to do so in and through its external action. So in a sense, we have both Europe and Africa, and I would argue that actually the relationship between these two continents is probably one of the most important in the world, which are really undergoing this double transition, and the relationship between them is going to be absolutely essential in terms of achieving its objectives. So no further words from myself. We'll now, in just a few moments, have the opportunity to discuss all this with our speakers. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to my partner in crime, Michael Vers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for volunteering to be on the panel today. Thank you for making time to join us in this day-and-a-half-long conference. As Natalie has mentioned, we had started relatively early with a conversation about nexus issues, the interplay of security, of climate, of migratory movements, of food supplies and food security. And when we approached the Stiftung Mercator, which is one of the more progressive, forward-leaning foundations in Germany, and they decided to fund this project for the first 3 years, we thought we'd have a hard task to elevate the issues that we care about much, that we think are of massive urgency for the international and global system. We thought we'd have a hard time elevating those issues to a very high level in the international policy and national security conversations. Half a year after we started the project, the invasion in Ukraine took place. And it was not only that this act of imperial warfare was something new for the region, it also demonstrated, not in slow motion, but in fast forward, the interconnectedness of global food markets. Because virtually hours after the invasion, you had spikes at the commodity markets in Chicago. Weeks after the invasion, you had often completely baseless and senseless export restrictions being passed in countries from India to South Africa to others. And we realized that this is an interconnected world in the very literal sense, that people will suffer hunger within a relatively short time period, thousands of kilometers away from what is the core battlefield. It has also shown a second thing, that the fact that as bad as the Ukraine war has played out, in military terms, this is still a relatively contained conflict in its topographical size. And the number of victims, although catastrophic, do not even begin to compare with the potential loss of human life and suffering through food insecurity. I'm not measuring deaths against deaths here, but I'm just saying that we need to understand that the global ripple effects are multipliers in terms of problems that we will face. If under those circumstances we think that we can exist in a world with two food systems, one in the north that works and one in the south that doesn't work, to put it simplistically, we are gravely mistaken. And that's why we have engaged with Nexus at high-level policy platforms like the Munich Security Conference, the spring meetings of the World Bank Group and others, and we've expanded the project, bringing in the Center for Climate and Security in 2023 to basically increase our capacity in the concrete security arena with the help of our friend Erin Sikorsky and her team. And so this is where we stand in that second phase of the project, where we'll be even more aggressively pursuing those conversations because we feel this urgent need. We have to figure out how to deal with complexities that institutionally, quite frankly, often intellectually and politically, we're not trained to do. I'm always saying the Cold War was a two-dimensional chess game. We counted warheads and armies and tanks, and we thought we had a take on what the security situation in the world would look like. Today, we are confronted with the need to play a three-dimensional chess game because of the interconnectedness of the issues that I've mentioned. And we have not yet learned, much less learned to win that three-dimensional chess game. So I'm grateful that you join us in pursuing and investigating the EU-Africa relationship, which is a very complex multilateral relationship in its own right, which has some strong features, but also helps us to identify tremendous gaps in the international system in the context of some of the most complicated issues that the African continent is facing right now. I'm not going to spell them out. All of you know them better than I do. But I feel that we have a real opportunity here to move the conversation forward. And we have representatives not only from a diverse set of regions that have joined us in Rome today, but also from a very diverse set of institutions. And that is what we do at Nexus. We bring people together that often do not talk together, but hopefully at the end of the day and a half, we'll realize that they should have talked together earlier and that there's much more overlap in what they do than they might have anticipated. So thank you again for making time. Thank you, Natalie, for the great cooperation. Very much looking forward to the first panel. Welcome again.
Thank you, Michael, and a very warm welcome to our panelists, both here in Rome with us, as well as online, given last-minute hitches with visas. We're very sorry about this. And I actually wanted to begin precisely with the African part of the story here. Normally we tend to do this in Europe the other way around, and I think it's high time to begin the conversation really by, for us here in Europe, trying to get a better understanding of how Africa understands its own transition. And I think this is particularly important given that now, particularly with the Nairobi Declaration, there is a vision there, and I think trying to get a better understanding, as I was saying earlier, about what this vision is and how is it that Africa understands its own role in achieving it, as well as the role that it foresees for Europe in the accomplishment of that vision, I think is extremely important. So let me perhaps begin online with you, with Afekena Jerome, Special Advisor to the Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy, and Sustainable Development for the African Union, in really asking you, Afekena, if you could give us, sort of a couple of minutes, in a sense, sort of summary of how you understand the Nairobi Declaration, and in particular, how you think that Europe could play a role in helping Africa succeeding in achieving its objectives. Afekena, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking Nexus and the IAI for the invitation to be part of this very important discussion. Invariably, it's important to bring in perspective of Africa to the table. But I want to begin with a caveat. The views expressed here are strictly mine and not that of the African Union Commission. Indeed, the EU Secretariat and EU Commission are very good partners, and we work very well at various levels. Through the Africa EU Partnership, we engage in political and policy dialogues and define the cooperative relationship between Africa and Europe. Indeed, the last major summit was the 6th EU-AU summit in Brussels in February 2022, where the partnership adopted a joint vision for 2030. I will return to this shortly. It's not as if there are no challenges in the relationship. Invariably, to go straight to your question on the Nairobi Declaration and my understanding of how we can move it forward. On a general note, I want to mention, first of all, that Africa is Europe's closest neighbor. The ties that bind Africa and Europe are broad and deep because of history, proximity, and shared interests. Why I did indicate that we work very well in Europe, the situation is such that Europe has been reformulating various strategies to guide its policies with Africa. In recent years, there has been continuous talk of rebooting and restarting the EU partnership to make it fit for purpose. At the same vein, you find that EU member states are also revisiting their engagement in Africa. Currently, I think about 10 EU member states have reformulated their own policies to establish new or reset own partnership with African countries. The latest is that of Italy during its service presidency, where it had a specific focus on Africa. In January 2024, Italy hosted the inaugural Italy-Africa Summit in Rome, which about 51 heads of states and government attended. This was intended to celebrate Italy's relationship with Africa, where the plan was launched. The financial commitment was about 5.5 billion euros, of which 3 billion was from Italy's climate fund. To sum up, on a general note, you find that while desire to do these different things in Brussels, translating into action has not been very easy, which is where I think, the meeting we are holding today is very, very important. And now turning to sustainable transition, which is the focus of our meeting today, which COP29 to hold in Baku next week, specifically from 11 to 22 January. This policy conference could not have come at a more opportune time. Like at the introduction, it was mentioned that Africa is very clear about its stance on climate change. Invariably, from 4 to 6 September 2023, the government of Kenya and the African Union hosted the inaugural Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, where African leaders produced the Nairobi Declaration and Climate Change Action, which stressed the importance of climate positive growth, green industrialization, and local value creation, while recognizing the cascading effects of climate change at borders and into economics. I'm not going to bore you with this particular declaration. I'm sure it's accessible and many of you are used to it. What it Japan is the emphasis Africa possesses both potential and the ambition to be a vital component of the global solution to climate change. As home to the world's youngest and fastest growing workforce, coupled with renewable energy potential, abundant natural resources, and an entrepreneurial secret, our continent has the potential to spearhead a climate-compatible pathway. That's a quote directly from that declaration. Invariably, the declaration has continued to serve as a strong contribution from the African continent to the global climate change process, including the first COP28 and beyond. Now, turning to the partners in Europe, what have we experienced? At the last summit in Brussels from 17 to 18 February 2022, a joint vision for 2030 was adopted with 4 deliverables at the heart. There was a global gateway for Africa Europe investment package, totaling 150 million worth of grant and investment, supported by the EU budget. I also don't bore you with other parts of this declaration. Let me just pick out the part that has to do with the climate transition. Invariably, the Africa investment package aims to support Africa for a strong, inclusive green and digital recovery and transformation by, among others, accelerating the transition, including supporting implementation of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, national adaptation plans of African countries, the Paris Agreement, to enhance both mitigation and the adaptation. Well, this Global Gateway Africa Euro Investment Package is being implemented through a couple of Europe initiatives. The EU, member states, and European Federation must work jointly to support concrete and transformational programs jointly identified priority areas. It's not as if they have not challenges. Let me highlight some few challenges in this arena. Talk specifically about the aspect of climate adaptation and resilience. You find that a Team Europe initiative on climate adaptation and resilience was adopted at COP24 in Egypt. I'm sorry, COP27 in Egypt. The essence of that is to mobilize 1 billion to improve identification of risk, strengthening policy and governance, and level resources. It is part of the global gateway strategy, which I alluded to earlier. Well, I do believe that this could be a game changer if it can be made credible. Thank you.
Thank you, Africana. Thank you so much. Mitika Mwenda, let me perhaps move on to you. Mikita is the Executive Director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And I really wanted to ask you, part of our Nexus approach is not only looking at the interplay between the various elements here, whether it's climate, security, food, etc., but also understanding the nexus in terms of the role that different stakeholders can play, and in particular the roles that not only institutions play, but also that civil society, NGOs, etc. can play. So perhaps, can you give us your sense, looking at the Nairobi Declaration, of what is the broader role that civil society is and should be can support players like yourself in achieving this vision?
Thank you very much, and it's very unfortunate that the technology has failed Africana, because this really I could have built from what he was speaking. Right. He is not speaking fiction. He is speaking exactly what happened, and I think painting that story of African success, the conversation, which I believe we have continued, asking ourselves what will be the role of Africa in the global conversation towards the transition to low carbon, climate resilient development pathways. And then the broader understanding of the transition, which we are calling just transition, is really misunderstood. The understanding of just transition in Europe, in Italy, in the US, in the North, is completely different from the way we understand it in Africa. Remember the whole conversation around just transition and its origin was the concern which has been brought by climate crisis that it's inevitable. Just transition is just like it's like the transition or the growth which we undergo as humans. You know, from Stone Age, agrarian revolution to industrial revolution, and then now we have in the era of the green revolution. So it is inevitable. So whether we want it or not, the transition is inevitable. I want to give you an illustration. So when Donald Trump in 2016 was campaigning on the basis of, Obama and killed the coal industry, and his campaign was revolving around, when I come back, I become the president, I will come and ensure that I return the coal industry. If you followed his presidency, he left 4 years later without having even revived a single coal plant. What does that tell you? The coal does not make any economic, any profit. It has no economic sense, and because of the prices of renewables has really gone down, and the technology has improved, the coal industry or fossil fuel may not make that economic sense. So whether we want it or not, look at the evolution of the electric cars. In some countries in Europe, including even China, you realize that in China, I was reading somewhere, almost 50% of their vehicles, they are more than 50% of their cars are now electric cars, and that tells you a story where we are going in future. So this transition is inevitable. So then when you come to Africa, Africa has a promise. For the first time, during the Africa Climate Summit, we are talking now away from lamentation about climate challenges, but more towards really opportunities provided by the changing climate, particularly in the green industrialization. And demand, for instance, for critical minerals, which is rising. And where are these critical minerals? These critical minerals, 30% of the critical minerals reserves, for instance, are coming from the African continent. They are located there. 70%, for instance, of the cobalt supply, important for batteries, is from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Manganese, all the 60% of the global manganese are coming from Ghana, Gabon, and South Africa. And so, adding value to this, and that's why that is very important in Africa, is that the value addition and the processing of these manufactured goods at the local level, it creates jobs. And when you create jobs in Africa, for instance, you are going to solve the migration crisis, which is really a big issue in Europe, because the young people there are not going to be looking for jobs, because jobs are going to be provided in abundance. You are going to really lift industries, both downstream and upstream. How are you going to do that? We have cobalt, we have copper, we have lithium, nickel, all these worth the industry, the global industry worth $50 trillion. The question is, are we taking advantage of this? That is the story of just transition. If we take it that way, and the collaboration, the EU-Africa collaboration can tell that great story. The only problem is that we have a document, a very good document, by 2030, the joint vision of the EU-Africa partnership, entered, as it has been mentioned here, in 2022. But the only problem is that is lying into the shelves of the two blocks. How are we going to ensure that we are operationalize that framework? And one of the operationalization frameworks then, as we speak now, is during the African Climate Summit. During the declaration, we agreed on a green industrialization framework. How are we going to ensure that that is not only rhetoric, that is not a promise which is told, a promise not really achieved? We have a long way to go. I see opportunities. The two continents are now in a new cycle. The EU has already an election. We have a leadership which is very robust. Leave alone the problem the geopolitical, challenges which we are experiencing. The African Union in next year, February, is going to usher in a new leadership. The leadership is going to be coming when we are going to have now the framework. So how do we set through very quickly and prepare the new leadership in the implementation of all this framework? We don't need to start afresh. Good thing is that we have cemented partnerships. If you attended the African Climate Summit, you saw the goodwill, you saw the enthusiasm, the robustness of the leaders, not only of the leaders, but us as the civil society, non-state actors, because we are going to play a very important role. Catalyzing that bottom-up, people-centered, country-owned, community-owned solutions, community-owned processes. In DRC, let's ensure that it is anchored to the people. The only problem with these frameworks is that they are normally cultivated at very high level, at leadership level, at heads of state level, and the furthest they can go is at ministerial, at national level. I think we need to change the story. We need really to robustly engage the people. How do we have conversations like this one more and more? Last June, on the front of climate action, we brought together with EU Africa Foundation, together with other partners, the negotiators, commissioners from the European Union, and those from Africa, so that we start, the story must start from somewhere. We started from that. We believe that the next year, 2025, is going to be very important. We have started those conversations. We have started the roadmap. And it is not the roadmap about COP30. It is not about climate. Climate is about everything. It is about debts. It is about how do we bring the debt, how do we ensure that this conversation brings together, is anchored within the ongoing conversation around global, financial architecture. How do we ensure that? Next year in Spain, we are going to have the FFD4, Financing for Development Conference. How is it going to be related to UN Social Summit in Qatar next year? So there must be, as somebody said, interconnectedness on this species. That silo way of working is not going to work. Everything is connected in one way or the other. The only problem is that we have the G7 doing their own work, G20 is their own work, the UN doing its own work, World Bank, we have just come from the World Bank's autumn meeting without realizing that all these are connected. We need, and by the way, it is the same government. How do we ensure that we avoid that silo way of working? The only way is, resources are limited, but there is goodwill. We can cultivate this. Synergy is very important. So thank you. I think, let me stop there. It's very important that, but what we see more opportunities in this global shift than challenges. What is only required is that we need to be honest with each other. EU need to be honest with Africa. There is a lot of trust building which need to be done. There is a lot of transparency. We need to be accountable to our people. How are we going to do that without also forgetting that, there are other actors emerging axis, whether their emergence is positive or not. The rise of the BRICS, for instance, is Africa going to go east, or is Africa going to go west? And what are the opportunities? What are the low-hanging fruits? How do we use our historical relationships, whether they are negative or positive, really to advance our common goals within the two continents?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I actually thought that was absolutely fantastic. And I think, Mitika, you raise a really powerful point, and I'm so happy that you raise it now and here, which is the fact that I think over the last few months, the last year or so, in Europe, there has been this growing distortion of the debate, which has tended to equate a just transition with a slower transition. And what you're saying here is absolutely existential, I would say, because what you're saying is, hey, firstly, just transition does not mean a slower transition. And in fact, a transition is the flip side of the coin of development and growth itself. And an Africa that transitions and that seizes the opportunities from the transition is an Africa that grows. And I think it is so important because I think, part of the argument of, oh, we have to slow down the transition is also, in the debates between the global north and the global south, again, another distortion, which I think is often sort of made in the narrative is, sort of countries in the global south basically saying, hey, you have to give us time, and, you've been, emitting CO2 for decades and centuries, and now it's kind of our turn to do it. I think you're making a really powerful point that then sort of boils down to, I think, a number of key components, which I would then now turn to Tony and then to Diana to comment on. The first is, in order to seize that opportunity, given the role that Africa plays and the opportunities that Africa has, particularly as far as critical raw materials are concerned, how do we prevent this from translating into a new form of extractionism and actually supporting Africa develop and move up, in a sense, that value chain by developing green industrial supply chains. So I think that's one key component, and what is the role that Europe can play in that respect and supporting Africa in that respect. I think a second element which you bring to the table is this idea that a just transition is one which sort of involves, in a sense, a very wide variety of players, and in particular connects to the local level and the community level. And how is it, again, that players like the European Union can develop their own policies vis-à-vis Africa by building in that community level within their policies. And then the third dimension, which I think you bring to the table, is how this all connects to the broader multilateral framework. And in particular, how to prevent that transition policies pursued, whether it's by the African Union, by the European Union, but then by other international players, from the World Bank to the IMF to the UN, the United States, so on and so forth, how to prevent that these are not all policies which are indeed developed within their own little silos. So with that kind of mouthful that Mitika has brought there, let me turn to you, Tony, perhaps first here. Anthony has basically been in this business really for quite some time. I mean, over the previous years, he did so with a commission hat on, and in particular, really driving forward the European Green Deal with Frans Timmermans when he was Executive Vice President of the European Commission. He has now changed hat and adopted still a climate hat, which is far more explicitly external as the EU's climate envoy. And so, Tony, I really kind of wanted to ask you, well, firstly, to reflect on some of the points which Mitika brought here to the table, but also ask you, going back to this Nexus idea, right? I mean, you have been in the business, particularly over the last, the previous 5 years, of really, in a sense, mainstreaming the Nexus in the EU's internal policies. Now you're tasked with, in a sense, looking outside the EU and in particular looking at Africa. How is it that basically this can be done, and what should be changed in our external action to do some of the things that Mitika was talking about?
That's a huge task. I'm still digesting the excellent remarks by Mitika. I loved what you said about just transition. First, allow me to thank you very much for inviting me in IAI and Nexus25. And of course, only in Rome you get to sit in a palazzo for such a thing. So thank you very much. I have to paint a context coming from the EU, and I was wondering how to do it, but 14 years ago, my son was 10 years old, and I was bold enough to say to his teacher when I brought him to school, when she said, "Do you want to say something about Europe to the class one day?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And then, of course, I found myself on a rickety tram going to this school, and thinking, what the heck am I going to tell 10-year-olds about Europe and the world? So I came in the class and I asked, I just asked, how many people live in the world? And these children were prescient and they said 7 billion. They knew that. Now it's 7.5, but it was 7 billion. And I asked them to rise, and I asked the girl who knew the answer, I said, can you divide this group between Europeans and the rest of the world? And there were 21 children, and she kind of carved out 10 children. I said, put them in the corner, and the other 11 children in the other corner. I said, are you sure this is how it is? Yes, they were sure. I said, okay, pay attention. So from those 10 children, I siphoned off 8. I said, those 2 are Europe in the world. You know what? I'll throw an extra kid in. Got one back. That's Europe and America. That's Europe and America. And Europe and America have dominated the world in terms of the international institutions, all forged after the Second World War, thought up by men, usually, who were born around 1885. And I tried to explain to them, everything that you take for granted now was thought up by these men, made for a world that does not exist anymore. And I tried to portray it in their terms. And I turned to the group of 11, they were 18 now. And I said, so what do you have to say to this? And this is 2010. And those kids, I kid you not, they said, now it's our turn. Right. Now it's our turn. These children in 2010 understood full well that we are in the midst of a huge paradigm shift, whether it's technological, the Industrial Revolution, AI, demographics we haven't spoken about yet, in terms of geopolitics coming back to the stage, the climate crisis, the biodiversity loss, pollution. All of this is coming together, and meanwhile, we're producing more history than the world can conveniently consume. So we're in the midst of something, and the EU is finding itself in a different position, fending for itself, challenged democratically, challenged geopolitically, challenged by climate, if you sum it up. And I think that's important to realize. Now, the good news is that in 2019, as you said, we put forward this Green Deal, which was our growth strategy, and I would like to argue it is still the only comprehensive plan anywhere where we talk from mobility, agriculture, built environment, energy, you name it, all of that, in how to put a fossil-fueled economy that exists for over a century and a half on a new footing as a growth strategy. And then COVID struck the whole world, obviously. That was the first accelerant, because people understood we can only spend $1 trillion once. We got to get it right from the get-go for recovery. And then the war came. That was the second accelerant, because of course, naively, as we thought that the world is flat and we can do this whole Green Deal by sourcing everything from everyone, anywhere in a peaceful world, of course fell flat on its head. And now we understood we have to be independent. So our Repower EU response, which was basically the 11th story on a 10-story Green Deal, was exactly that, weaning ourselves off of this addiction of Russia, getting our gas down very quickly, diversifying in the short term, but going renewable in the long term. And I say all this to show that was quite a feat politically. And we knew that this window of opportunity could close, but I'm happy to say after the elections, anyone who reads the political guidelines of President-designate von der Leyen will see that the Green Deal, which will be called the Clean Deal or Clean Industrial Deal, the labels will be different. We're staying the course, and nobody should be mistaken about it, because there is no way back. And I think, Mitika, what you said, it is inevitable. It will be bumpy. We'll trip and fall. We'll make mistakes. There will be vested interests petrochemical interests who will do their best to eke out the last molecule of gas or drop of oil to make a profit. But I am absolutely convinced that that business model is in its dying days. And that's a good thing. As you say, there's a lot of opportunity there. So the EU is staying the course. Our external realization is manifold. The first is something I'm pushing real hard, and I'm glad I met Erin Sikorsky yesterday. I wish I met her before, but together with Diana and others in the Commission and the EES, we say, listen, we have to have a new prism to understand that climate change and environmental degradation are existential crises, but they also affect conflict and peace and security. They affect migration or migratory movements. They affect conflicts over arable land, over critical materials, over water. Water is going to be huge. And if we don't see that, if we cannot look through our prism, we will be flying blind. So we're trying to put momentum there, not as a new policy, because then I'll lose, but as a prism to say, all our external actions have to start looking in a different way so that we can line that up better. The second thing is, of course, when we green our own society and economy, we cannot just wash our hands in innocence and then export our dirty production or trade elsewhere, because hey, that's a bit silly, right? So we've created a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I'm not going to explain the technicalities of it, but the basic premise is that any country that goes through a transition has to redress the problem of carbon leakage, so not exporting your dirty production, creating a level field. We have a deforestation regulation, which we're getting a lot of grief for, but the basic premise was there that the EU does no longer want to be a driver of global deforestation through its consumption of rubber, coffee, palm oil, soy, timber, and then some will say, well, that's protectionism. We say, well, it's a sovereign choice. We don't want to drive that. But it has made us realize that this external dimension of our policies, we need to be better in explaining upfront and explaining real well what it is and what it isn't. And we have to be better in gearing our policies to help our partners, because ultimately that's what we want. Because as you say, we're all in the same boat. We cannot sit high and dry in one part of the boat and say, your part is sinking, good luck. That's not how it is. We're all in the same boat. So to sum up, and Diana can tell a lot more about it, I think we're having that realization. The EU-Africa, I would say, umbilical link is clearly recognized. We're twin sister continents. I think you said we need an honest conversation, and we have to be honest. I think Africa has to, I think we both have to be honest, because our relationship is often put in terms of prejudices, misunderstanding. That's still there. You spoke about a common history. I think we need to overcome it and see the positive sides of it. The Global Gateway, which has 150 billion euros up until 2027, I think is a big investment program. We're doing stuff on energy, 50 gigawatt. We're pouring 20 billion into that. We're doing on environment, adaptation. It's not perfect. I think Hannah Knappe has written a scary, very good article that I read yesterday, very critical of what we're doing. I'm sure we could do better, but we're doing a heck of a lot, and 2025 is very important. We hope that this summit comes to the fore. We are going to push for a ministerial and build on, as you say, the goodwill that is there, because at a political level, it's absolutely there. And so just to sum up, science implores us. Our health warns us. The economy beckons us. It really beckons us. And the youth is spurring us on. We got this, but we got to do this now. So.
Well, thank you so much for that, Tony. And this is, I think, a great segue also in turning to Diana Concha. Diana, Head of International Affairs and Climate Finance in DG Klima, the European Commission. And Diana, I mean, it's quite clear that if, on the one hand, we are to, as Mitika was saying, seize the opportunities and ensure that our transition and Africa's transition actually leads to growth and development. If it is clear, as Tony was saying, that to do all this, it is really a question of connecting many of the dots in our own policies. It is also true that to do this, at times we need to get into the nitty-gritty technicalities of it. And I think there are really two aspects that I wanted to ask you about. The first is obviously climate finance, which is a big part of what your work is. It is very clear that not everything boils down to money, but a lot boils down to money, because while it is true that the transition is inevitable, while it is true that it is perhaps inevitably messy, it is absolutely clear that the messiness can be mitigated and the transition can be accelerated if funds are actually put on the table. So perhaps if you could, on the one hand, address this question of climate finance and how the EU's climate finance can support the realization of the goals of the Nairobi Declaration. And secondly, if you could perhaps zoom into this question of standards. I mean, Tony touched on it when he was referring to CBAM, to the deforestation regulation. In general, the EU has prided itself for its Brussels effect for a long time. I mean, the idea of the contribution that Europe makes in contributing to global standards. So I wonder if you could also perhaps zoom in on this particular question. Not so much touching on the CBAM point, which we already have touched on, but perhaps, broadening and looking at the role of standards in areas like biodiversity, nature preservation, etc. What is it that perhaps, looking at those 5 years ahead, that you can do in order to support Africa in developing its own standards on these issues?
Thank you very much. First of all, good morning, everybody, and thanks to the organizer for inviting me. This is a great opportunity also for me to talk about what makes me tick, my passion beyond my job. It's always difficult to speak about Tony. He gives the big picture, and then you ask me about the money. And that's my karma. Every time I speak with Tony, which happens very often, it's always like this. So I will try to make it a little bit interesting, even if I'm talking about money, though I don't know if I will manage. But, okay, first of all, what do we talk about when we talk about climate finance? Because it's the definition officially does not exist. This is one of the grievances, by the way, that others have against the so-called developed countries or donors. But when we talk about climate finance, we used to talk about the billions and the trillions. And the billions being the public finance that goes from developed to developing countries and the private finance directly mobilized by this public finance. And this was the famous or infamous 100 billion commitment that developed countries finally reached in 2022. And then we have the trillions, which is the whole of the other sources, private and philanthropies and innovative financial instruments and whatever, which is not directly mobilized by public finance, but perhaps it can be catalyzed if we use public finance correctly. This is a big part of the discussion that we're going to have at COP29 in a few days' time in Baku. We are looking for a goal which will have 2 layers, the public and the private, to be very, very broad, and the billions and the trillions, hopefully. We are not there yet, but there seems to be a consensus around the fact that public finance cannot do everything, and that it is very important to create conditions for the private finance to come around. But this is just, it's not what I really want to talk about, because I want to go on a more practical side, on what is really interesting for Africa. It's also a quite known fact around practitioners that there is no scarcity of private capital around the world. The problem is that the capital does not go to the places where it should go, and does not go to the places where it's difficult, because capital is opportunistic and is lazy. So it's very easy to continue to finance fossil fuels, because they give, at least in the short term, a sure revenue stream. But this is a very short-sighted approach, because as the colleague said, the transition is inevitable. The demand for fossil fuels will go down. Fossil fuels will generate stranded assets. But for a world where this year bottom line is what matters, capital will still continue to go there if we don't create the right set of incentives. Capital is also lazy because it's risk averse. They don't want to go where there is risk. And risk is higher, or is perceived to be higher, in emerging and developing economies, and particularly in Africa. In some cases, this perception is correct. In some other cases, this perception is not correct, and we have to help correct the perception. Why am I saying this? Because I think we cannot talk finance without talking policies, without talking about the enabling environment for finance to come. And I think the key challenge, and I have to say my personal commitment and quest in my job is what creates this condition. What do we do to move the capital from the US, Europe, China, and the sectors with a sure revenue to emerging economies and Africa, and to the sectors where it's difficult and where it's risky. And here I think this is the space where the EU and Africa can partner, but we have to be two to tango, and the policies have to go hand in hand with the finance. And policies are the responsible of the African countries. We can help, but there is a responsibility on Africa's side. The policies have to be set up by African governments. I don't say that all African countries have to have a European Green Deal. Such a comprehensive agenda, as Tony was saying, is unique, even if I must say some countries are starting to follow us and to imitate it. But we're not asking for the same level of ambition for all African countries. We're not asking for a set of NDC, for example, that gives a net zero goal for everybody, also because African countries emit very little, and this is not precisely the point of what we're looking for. But what we are looking for is a signal, is policy signal, is policies that, for example, make it easy to come with renewable energy investment, that allow the companies that want to put, factories that want to put solar panels on the roof to do it relatively easy, that allow European or other investors that want to come with renewables to plug in the grid, that also create a safe macroeconomic environment for the banks to come and finance the grid that is needed, the storage that is needed to set this up. Signals that biodiversity is protected, because biodiversity, let's remember, is also a source of bioeconomy. They need to support circular economy, a circular approach, which is intrinsical, I think, in the African mentality, and it has to be fostered, because that's also a very interesting area to invest, and so on and so forth. And also they have to give signals in their budgets. That's also very important. Fiscal space in Africa is limited. I will talk about that in a moment. But there are ways to tweak the budget so that the signals are clear. Put the price on carbon. Some countries have been brave in Africa, Nigeria, they have cut fossil fuel subsidies drastically. That's important. That's an important policy signal. These kind of signals are creating the environment for the investment to come. On our side, on the finance side, what we should do? First of all, we should be flexible. No one-size-fits-all approach. Tony has mentioned Global Gateway. We can do a lot with Global Gateway because we can support policies. And by the way, here in the DG Klima, we have policy expertise, which is there available for policy dialogue. We have a task force that is helping countries that want to set up carbon pricing and carbon markets domestically to set them up. So this is also something that we can do together. But then Global Gateway brings the technical assistance and the public finance which is necessary to catalyze the intervention of the banks. Tony said 150 billion investment. This is certainly not coming from the EU budget. It's coming from the banks. It's coming under Team Europe from all the member states' financial institutions. It has to come from philanthropies. It has to come from European companies. And European companies have to come with investment. So we have to really work all together, the public sector, the banks, and the regulators to make it happen. We need to look at innovative financial sources. I was last week in Washington for the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank. I participated in the steering group of this task force, which was co-created by Kenya and co-chaired by Kenya as well, on the global solidarity levy. So to find global forms of taxation that can be then used for climate finance worldwide. It's a very high feat. It was launched last year in Paris by France and Kenya, and now Barbados is also co-leading. The European Commission is observer, and we will lead a work stream on trying to tax aviation to find revenues for climate finance. Very difficult. I am under no illusion that the fossil fuel countries will easily be convinced in taxing fossil fuels or aviation or other polluting sources. But I think we have to try. This is a crucial point. I know that, for example, Kenya spends, if I remember correctly, 57% of their budget in debt service. And this is obviously unacceptable. This is a really a big stone that weighs on the ability of African countries to invest. In G20, the discussion under the common framework are very advanced to tackle that, but I think everybody here knows that it's not the European Union countries that are blocking that restructuring. It is China. Let's call things with their name, because they don't want to have haircut of their debts, and it is extremely difficult to come to agreement. I know that it's been done for Zambia. I think it's also been done or close for Ghana, but these discussions are very difficult, and it's because there are many actors that are intervening in the process. So everything is part of this very complex picture. There are innovative financial instruments that help. I know that, for example, Kenya, again, is issuing green bonds. This can also help for certain countries. But this is to say that we really need a blend. We need to work at African level, for example, like the EU has done with the Team Europe initiative on adaptation, that I also read the criticism to it, and we can have a discussion about it, but I think it is still an attempt to put different work streams on adaptation together, and also to finance some very interesting African initiatives like the Africa Risk Capacity, which is basically paying flood and let's say loss and damage, let's call it like this, insurance to in a lot of African countries. So it's something that needs to certainly be encouraged. But at the same time, we need to work with countries. In the EU, I personally have a small team, so I don't have the capacity to work with everyone and single countries. But there are some countries which are lighthouses in Africa because they have taken certain decisions and because they want to go ahead. And I don't want to be monotonous and mention Kenya again, but this is one of the countries that was the force behind the Nairobi Declaration and has really embraced the transition, and we have to support them. But we are working a lot with South Africa as well with the just energy transition, but partnership that we would like to bring to the next level. We've started a climate dialogue with Nigeria. We have a green partnership with Morocco. We also work a lot with Egypt. So we need to work with these countries that can go ahead faster, because we know that there are other countries where the conditions for this private investment to come are not yet there. And so we need to do a different type of work with these countries in really trying to address the basic humanitarian needs, to work on that, on climate as a threat multiplier on security matters and conflict generation, and try to bring the level of governance to a point where then private investment can come. So as I said, the differentiated strategy. On your second point, Natalie, which is very interesting, and indeed I don't want to talk about CBAM because it's one piece of a much more complex picture. You were talking about the standards. And yes, it's not necessarily easy to trade with the European Union. I've worked, by the way, on trade policy for 20 years, so I know something about it. We have standards, we've always had them. Before it was the sanitary and phytosanitary standard, you know, the health and public and animal health requirements, and now it is the Green Deal policies like the deforestation regulation and the eco-design rather than the waste shipments regulation or the plastic packaging and so on and so forth. And yes, it is, we need to step up the dialogue with our partner countries on these standards, because we want to keep our market open for the products that are clean, and we want to help other countries to go towards the way of green industrialization. I know that, as Tony said, our market is not as big as it used to be. The Brussels effect has weakened, but it still exists. The European market is still attractive because it's a market that pays well. First of all, we're paying good prices. But also, European investment to countries is still very attractive. And I think I want to put the accent on this. Because European investment, I'm sorry to say, it is different from investment from other countries because it comes with a package. It comes with technical assistance, it comes with respect of human rights, it comes with environmental integrity, it comes with skills training to the host country of the investment. Actually, what I'm saying, I've heard last week from our Director General for industrialization from DG Grow. She was talking about our critical raw material agreements with different countries. I think we have 15 of them now. And she said they work exactly because of this. Our partners are very happy to receive our investment because it is coming as a package. It is coming as something that makes them grow. It is perhaps slower than the Chinese investments, but it is different from Chinese investments. So there is still a big interest in working with us. And one way that we want to work with us, Tony mentioned the Clean Industrial Deal, which is our next conjugation or permutation of the Green Deal, but basically it's the continuation of the Green Deal. And it's coming with an external pillar, which are the clean trade and investment partnerships. For the moment, this is still very embryonic stage, but what we would like to have is a new form of partnership, which is putting together trade, rules, regulation, investment, and finance. And this is very innovative because while trade agreements created purely a framework for trade to happen, but did not necessarily tackle the enablers for the trade to really happen and to be really beneficial for our partners, particularly with Africa. I negotiated the economic partnership agreement with, among others, Kenya. I was the first negotiator of the EPA that is now in force, so I sort of know what I'm talking about. What these CTIPs want to create is exactly the enabling condition for the investment and trade to happen for real by breaking the silos and having, on the one hand, a whole-of-government approach for the Commission, but also a whole-of-government approach from our partners. So I am very excited by this new adventure which is starting. Again, I cannot say more because it's a very initial stage, but you can read about it on the political priorities of the Commission. And I think that the discussion on standard will be a very important discussion in these partnerships.
Well, thank you so much, Diana, for this. And in order to make this a dialogue, actually, before opening up to the floor, Mitika, I wanted to come back to you, perhaps to react to some of the things that you heard there from Tony and Diana, and in particular, amongst the various things that were raised, I think there was this point that Diana was making right at the beginning, and basically saying, in a sense, the EU can support, but to the extent that there are policies in place in Africa, and obviously that depends on Africa. So your reaction to that. I'd be interested to hear also what you make of this argument of, I mean, it is very clear that there are African frontrunners there, but the effect that those countries can have in a sense, kind of accelerating the transition journey for in the entire continent. I think a sort of other question, I mean, I understand that this is still in its infancy, but I thought it was fascinating, this idea of the green trade and investment partnerships. But I think it'd be interesting to hear from an African perspective how, compared to, in a sense, the EPAs as were, how can these new types of agreements, I mean, how could they be tailored in order to actually support Africa in its transition? I see that there is, but I don't know whether, I see that Africain is back. I don't know whether his connection has been restored properly or not, but let me, Mitika, come back to you with some of these responses.
Yes, so I think the new Green Deal, for instance, when it started, the discussion about it, we were very, very enthusiastic, and we thought that it was a panacea for the whole EU takeoff in terms of the green and the climate collaboration. But all of a sudden, like any other document, like any other framework, it's not really, it has not been pronounced the way we expected. But more importantly, is what we are talking about, the mix of, the paradigm shift, which is, as I've said, we really need to look into the inevitable phase of development which we are going through. And we need really to address many factors which, of course, my sister has talked about. How do we address these prejudiced misunderstandings? Because that's all what we have been having all through the relationship between the EU and Africa. What I believe that is set a wake-up call between the EU and vis-a-vis the EU, the role of EU at global level, which is the emerging, as I mentioned, the emergence, for instance, of a very strong axis. EU majorly gravitates towards the G20 group of countries. I was following the meeting in Russia of the G20 plus. I mean the BRICS plus. And that is not the bloc. We had a discussion over the same in a group which we have. We said, we agreed the BRIC plus accounts for 60% of global emissions, current global emissions. And that also tells you now where it stands within the global geopolitical climate interactions and the conversation. And so, are we going to treat, for instance, a country like China, which is in the G77 and China bloc, the same way we are going to treat the Malawi as a developing country? So these are very critical questions which we have to ask our question ourselves. And so when the North, when EU is appropriating climate finance, for instance, China, by the virtue of being a member of the South, expect to benefit from adaptation finance, which should go to Malawi, which is a very needy country. By 2030, 6 years from now, 90% of the world poor will be based in Africa, okay? And so, and look at where the level of other major polluters and major emerging economies are in terms of development. And this is a very difficult question then. Who should provide climate finance? So what would be the role of the EU in all this conversation? So that's the point number one. But more importantly, I'm not vouching because in some quarters, we are not allowed to speak anything which shift the debt, the burden of action and the burden of finance to the South. But we find this, as you are saying, it's a contradiction. So how then are we going to deal with this issue? But when we talk, because she has referred so much to the Africa and Kenya, actually, where I come from, one of the essential elements of an effective just transition and climate action, including climate finance, is really good governance. The principles of transparency, accountability, and also really looking at each other and telling, yes, if the floodgates of finance are today opened, we say EU provides all the billions, trillions which are required. Are we sure that money is going to go to the people at the front line of climate crisis? So what governance institutions do we have? What policy frameworks do we have so that we ensure that that money goes to the people in need? Remember, there are also elites within the African country, both for us as the civil society, both as us as think tanks, both are the government, which actually remain a stumbling block for the people to build resilience at local level. We have mentioned Kenya. What has happened, just as an example, for instance, at Kenyan level, this has not been tokenism. It's not actually about the government. It is about the people. People's consciousness, one, we bequeathed ourselves a very robust, a very good constitution, a constitution which is even better than Italian constitution, which is better than European constitution, driven by the people, owned by the people, and people-centered constitution, which holds everyone accountable. Which you were following just recently, the rise of the people because of overtaxation. People said no. And the president and the government had to say, yes, we accept, but of course at the expense of some people dying or something like that. But you see that robustness. So it is about governance. So we have got now one of the EU and the World Bank funded program is called Financing Locally Led Climate Action, which really trickled where the power of the people is really anchored into that. It is a bottom-up, bottom-up, people-centered, people-driven action where the money, you can trace even the coin at the village level, where the people have control of their resources. Of course, it is not 100%, but these are models which we think that we can replicate into higher levels, and this is what we want really all the donors. I'm very happy all donors are really focusing onto that in putting money, and through now the AFDAN, African Designated National Authorities Network, which is another intergovernmental agency, we are replicating that across Africa. So there are very good stories which we can tell in terms of on the implementation. But what that now, the challenge is, who is going to put money there? Is it EU? Is it Italy? Is it Germany? Those are stories, things which we need to discuss. So finally, as we discuss that, climate finance is an emotive issue, and we hope Baku will deliver the global finance goal, NCQG. But it is beyond that. In 2015, in COP19, you remember when a year later we established, I'm saying we established because we as the civil society were actually at the front line of fighting for a global financial institution to finance climate action, which was beyond World Bank and beyond the democratic financial institutions. That came to be in Brazil, in Cancun. That is the Green Climate Fund. But what has happened? It is easier to get money from the World Bank than the Green Climate Fund. It is very difficult. It is so bureaucratic, and to explain what is a climate rationale actually becomes very difficult. So we establish institutions thinking that they are going to solve the problem, they create more problems. And so what we need to do, of course, what's innovative methods of climate finance is not going to be just really multilateralism. It is going to be really how are we going to cooperate through bilateral ways so that we appropriate money as fast as possible to the communities at the front line of climate crisis. To get green climate finance money, for adaptation, for a community in my drier areas, which requires urgent money for adaptation, will take 3 years. By the time we will deliver that money, those communities will have perished either by drought or through the floods. That is the other contradictions which we have. And so finally, what we need to do as communities is, I believe that we have institutions. We have the EU Green Deal. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have CBAM, though we have some challenges with it in terms of also what it means to smallholder farmers in Africa, the forest framework, and all this. We have what it takes. What we lack is really political goodwill, particularly on the EU side. We need to build trust. We need to open our eyes and look at each other openly and tell us we need each other. but without forgetting that the world is changing. We need really to a conversation about the role of EU in the evolving geopolitical landscape dominated by wars, dominated by nationalistic interests, and the rise of the right-wing movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitika, for that. And let me now open the discussion up, perhaps collecting a few comments or questions. Could you please identify yourself before doing it? So the floor is open. Who wants to break the ice? Yeah, there's a question there at the back and then here at the front.
Thank you very much.
Please stand up.
Hi, my name is Susie Dennison from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for a fascinating panel. I wanted to raise a question which I think is linked to the point which Mithika, you made earlier on in your comments about the different perspectives on the just transition between Europe and Africa in terms of our understanding of it. And I wanted to ask a question which I think is for all of the panel really, on what do you think the increasing level of competition within the relationship will mean in sort of 10 or 20 years' time if, as we expect, what we're heading towards is more like a kind of 2 or 3 degrees global warming against 1990 levels, and that kind of makes things more complex. I think we all assume that that will make the climate finance conversation more complex politically within Western states. I think we all assume as well that that will increase possible migratory pressures coming from climate. But I wondered if you could reflect specifically on Europe-Africa relationships and how you see this evolving picture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a great question, Susie. There was a question over here at the front. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if it's open.
Yeah.
It is open.
It is. Stand up, please.
Okay, I'm Mariano Valesano, currently an intern at Istituto Affari Internazionali. I have 2 questions, if I can. The first one is about the period after the war in Ukraine, where the European Union went through a process of diversification of energy resources, and especially when it comes to natural gas, it turned to, at least in some parts, to Africa with some investments. And this was judged by some analysts as a case where we know that the world is moving away from natural gas to renewable resources, but still we invested kind of to gain our short-term interests in natural gas in Africa, ignoring the transition. So I would like to know what you think about that.
Happy to do
something. And the second question is about credibility of the European Union. We are kind of going through a crisis of credibility in the global south, not least for our support to Israel. And I would like to know if this has some transfer in dialogues in transition and climate issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. There's a question there.
Thank you. I'm Joye Tikum. I'm from coming in from Senegal. I'm with UNDP. Mine is more a short reflection. I wanted to pick up from where I think, Tony, you said Europe is trying to repower, EU is trying to, you have a strategy to repower EU. I think that's actually what Africa is also doing. Africa wants to repower itself. There's a series of dichotomies that I would like to mention 3. One is that the current debate around decarbonization and the transition, be it just or far, I think for the past 2 decades has been framed here in Europe. It has not been framed, in my opinion, with Africa. It has primarily been an exploitation of ideals and how Europe sees the world. And I think that's changing. And you've acknowledged that yourself with the example of the students which you mentioned. I think there is a greater recognition that the world of today is not the world as it were when most of these policies were developed. I think the second item, the second big discussion is around the global carbon taxation regime. There's a big debate around who pays for what, how we tax those who emit more. I think by and large, Africa had been on the receiving end, and there's been an awakening on the African side that has now also questioned some of these debates, and Africa is saying the carbonization conversation has to change, and perhaps the frameworks that has guided taxation around decarbonization must be looked into. The third point, also in terms of the narrative and how it's changing, is around the transition, the just transition. I think a bigger component of the just transition debate has been moving away from fossil and going into the green. But what Ukraine showed us is that even Europe is still struggling. Even Europe hasn't migrated properly, and that when the crisis in Ukraine happened, we saw the panic and the shock in Europe because the world is still heavily reliant to an extent on fossil. And so the conversation around moving from fossil to green, from an African point of view, is very different from what you hear in most European discussions. The Africans are saying, we are not running away from fossil yet, but we recognize the value in expanding the green space to ensure that even at the domestic level, we are able to cater for our services and our need, but that there has to be a combination between fossil and green in the transition that must happen, the industrial transition that must happen. How we as an international community, how Europe takes into account this new world order in developing its Repower Europe, or in developing its relationship with the rest of the world, I think it's something that needs to be interrogated differently. I think we've gone for so long on a one-sided interrogation. And finally, it's on the debt management. My brother there mentioned that by 2030, you're going to have a lot of Africans living in poverty. But it's also true that you're going to have the youngest population on the planet coming from Africa. So there's a big potential of this migratory movement continuing to be a challenge for Europe. But for Africa, it sees this surge in its youthful demographic as an opportunity, as a human capacity opportunity, as an internal mobility, labor mobility opportunity. The conversation around debt and how Europe refocuses or rechannels its grace period for African countries to manage its debt so it can divert some of these resources into transition. It's another conversation that I think platforms of this nature must interrogate properly, because until we're able to help these governments manage their debt maturity and their debt payment, the conversation around financing green, it's just going to continue to be a narrative on paper, which it has been since COP15. COP15 is when we talk about financing the green space or financing the transition. We're getting into COP28. We've not even succumbed to the pledges that we made at COP15. We're already into COP28 and we're still having the same conversation. But it's good that we're having these kinds of discussions, because I think mutualizing our conversations between Africa and Europe provides greater understanding of what each and every one of us needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there's a question here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Sharif Dawood. I'm from the Embassy of Egypt, and I thank the panelists for their very interesting presentation. I'll focus on 2 points, which would be kind of a mix between a comment and a question. The first one is the issue of the climate finance, which we have been personally to the COPs process since the COP21 in Paris until the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. We have been always hearing this concept of from billions to trillions, despite the fact that it's a very much debatable concept. Some reports are mentioning that we have reached already the target of the $100 billion. Others have mentioned that we have not reached this target yet. And of course, it depends on the methodology on how you count it and you calculate it. But this is a long debate I don't want to enter. My point I want to touch upon is the question of the access to finance, because this is really a real challenge to the developing countries. I would go with the assumption that the money is there, which is there really, maybe not enough, maybe not directed in the right channels, but the access to this finance is very much challenging to the developing countries, including the African countries. I'll add this to the previous point mentioned by the previous speaker about the debt management, the very narrow fiscal space, which I believe this would necessitate a sort of a comprehensive dialogue between Africa, Europe, and also other actors, including the MDBs, in order to enhance and facilitate the access to the finance without increasing the debt burden. My second and last point would be about the CBAM and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I've been also following this very closely, and to be honest, some developing countries, including countries in Africa, are seeing this as a kind of non-tariff trade barrier. I'll put it in black and white. And this is preventing the access of the exports from the developing countries, especially from Africa, to the European market. Having said that, this would, of course, impact the financial flows coming from trade to the African countries, which may enable them to invest more in green transition. I'll also add to this that the carbon market within the EU is a closed market. It's not a market that EU can trade with other countries. I'll add to this that also we have the previous carbon credits from the clean development mechanism that are there, and we are unable to trade it in the market. So I would like also to hear from you, how can we kind of find a way around this problems that are there for the carbon markets alongside with this. My final point that I'll conclude. I'm sorry for taking for so long. This is just a very important point to check to mention. The issue of the sustainability of demand is key for Africa in order to invest into green transition. So, for example, we had several debates about the green hydrogen, how important it is. However, we are not able to find a sort of sustainable offtake for the green hydrogen, which is a very big hindrance for the investments. On the other hand, we are hearing also that there could be subsidies to the developed countries investing in this, which would impact the competitiveness of the exports of green hydrogen from developing countries. And this also a point has to be taken into consideration. I thank you and I apologize for taking it so long.
Thank you. Let me take a final question over here.
Okay, thank you for the presentations. I listened with great interest. So I work for ECDPM, which is a think tank on Europe-Africa relations. And if you allow me to generalize, one of the main conclusions of our analysis is that the EU is increasingly inward-looking and foreign policy is being used as an instrument to serve self-interest. And that's often how it's been seen by African partners. So given this, my question would be, like, what does that mean for the adaptation finance agenda? Also, given the political and geopolitical shifts we see, the new set of commissioners, I think this question builds on what the first question by Susie. And then in the short run, COP29, a lot of focus on climate finance. What will be the EU offer in a way? So when it comes again to adaptation specifically, if we think of the NCQG discussion, the global goal on adaptation, what can we expect that the EU will offer, if I can say that?
Thank you so much. I mean, they're fantastic questions and packed with, multiple questions within the questions. So there's a lot there to answer. Let me go in reverse order. And Diana, perhaps let me start with you.
How much time do we have for the end?
Well,
can we have until tomorrow?
3-4 minutes each. You've got climate finance, you've got CBAM, you've got quite a lot on your plate.
Okay, I'm going to pick the whole carbon and the just transition, etc., and then I will leave the more general questions to Tony.
Well, I might add.
You might add, then you will go in beyond your 4 minutes. So on the whole carbon pricing set of questions, yes, there has been indeed talk about how we come to a global carbon price. A lot of institutions are working on it. There has been the proposal from the Director General of the WTO to have a global carbon price which differentiated level according to the level of development. The IMF is also working on sort of ideal carbon pricing for the whole world. And we are working with all these institutions to find a solution to what we admit it is a problem, the fact that there are different levels of carbon pricing around the world. Actually, for us, the biggest problem is that only a percentage, I think it's a bit less than 30% of emissions is covered by a form of carbon price. We think that it would be much better if all emissions would be covered by carbon price, but we're not there yet. But we are seeing more and more countries countries that are going that way, partly stimulated by EU CBAM, partly stimulated by the fact that other countries are also thinking of CBAMs, and I would say the United States doesn't have carbon pricing, but there is a serious bipartisan thinking of putting a carbon border tax, so the world will certainly pay attention. But there are also other countries that are creating quite comprehensive emission trading systems like Brazil, that may lead to also a form of external taxation. So the problem exists, that needs to be tackled. And I think one principle that we should think about is that the carbon price has to be effective. It has to create an effect of incentivizing a reduction of emission. And the level of the carbon price that is necessary in a market to reduce emissions is not the same in the EU and in, for example, Egypt. It can be $20 per ton in Egypt and $80 per ton in the EU. And this creates the question of carbon leakage, and that's why CBAM exists. It doesn't exist as a trade barrier, but it exists to address the carbon leakage, so the fact that where there is a high carbon pricing, investment in energy-intensive industry could simply go elsewhere, or they could simply go elsewhere, and then the products would be imported and the emission would be imported. And if we didn't have a carbon border mechanism, we would probably be accused by the whole climate community to be subcontracting emissions and importing emissions. So that's also something that I don't hear often, but that I'm sure it would happen. So what is the solution? Is, first of all, to support all countries that want to have carbon pricing policies domestically, to talk to all the countries and to help them actively, which is what we are doing, because as I said before, we have established a task force which is going to support countries. By the way, the task force had just been on a mission in Egypt last week, and they had very interesting conversations around Egypt carbon tax, so we are open to collaborate. But then there is the other important point. There is the embedded emission in the product. We are working to clean up our value chains. So countries that are going to produce, for example, steel with renewable energy, other products with hydrogen with renewable energies, they will have the emission content of their product taken into account when the border tariff is applied. So there are two ways to reduce the impact of CBAM: carbon pricing and cleaning up the value chain. We are engaging on both, and that's why I said before, we want to continue to import clean products. We want our market to be clean. We will need products from all over the world because we are not going to produce all the steel that we need. Never. We want to keep a steel industry, but we will not produce everything in the EU. So we have a very strong interest in bilateral conversation, in multilateral conversation, for example, in WTO, in plurilateral context like the Climate Club launched by Germany, and that is going to have an important declaration at COP29 in continuing this discussion. I also wanted to say something about this just transition and how different it is. The just transition in Europe is first and foremost the support to the workers and to the areas which are hit in one way or the other by the green transition. We have countries that are still coal dependent, where there are still coal mines, for example, Poland, and we support those countries and those workers. And we are happy to do the same in other countries. We have an expertise, and we would be happy to exchange on what just transition means in Europe, what it means in Africa, what it means in other countries. There are African countries with similar problems, like in South Africa. We are exactly looking at that, how to get out of coal, and how we can help the workers to find better jobs, more sustainable. In other countries, it may mean something different, but we have to remember that the fossil fuel demand will go down. In Europe, we plan to reduce our fossil fuel demand 80% by 2040. We are a big importer. Marginal producers of fossil fuels will be out of the market, so the problem will come one way or the other. And finally, I wanted to make a point in response to what you said before, very quickly, two points actually. One of them is Malawi is not the same as China, absolutely not. So we don't expect Malawi to do the same in China as China. China is not a recipient of climate finance. Let's say they take it. They say it themselves. They don't want to be a donor, but they also don't want to be. They accept that they are not a recipient. But when we go to Baku, and one of the points on the table will be who are the donors, okay? The famous donor basis, who will contribute particularly to the core of public finance. We, the EU, we are the leading donors and we will continue to lead to do our part. But if we want to substantially increase this amount, there will have to be other donors that can do it, and there are in proportion to their economic development and to the emission that they contribute. Who's the first emitter? It's China with 30% of emissions. But there are others that can contribute. We talk about, I don't know, Turkey, Korea, Singapore, countries that have also shown certain openness. The UAE, that I think did a lot last year in launching the contributions to the Loss and Damage Fund. So we need to talk about these countries. We need, as a minimum, to consider, to take into account what they are already doing. And we would like the support of African countries to tell them so, because we haven't heard them enough. But if we want the cake to increase, we need to increase also the contributors to the cake. And the second point on the role of civil society, please continue to put the pressure to your governments to apply green policies, to embrace the transition, to see the advantages and not to get stuck into the fossil fuel dependency. We really need you in Africa to speak to your governments, because then our governments have to come to us and tell us what they want from us.
Thank you so much. Africana, please.
Great discussion so far, and there is a broad agreement on the table that both Africa and Europe need themselves. But how do we ensure that this relationship is mutually beneficial? That is where I want to quickly come in. Invariably, my first comment is to react to the presentation by Diana, which is very, very fruitful. In Africa, we sincerely appreciate the adaptation finance. But so far, you find that it's only the big countries, the relatively rich African countries, that are benefiting from this funding. How do we make sure that it flows to the relatively poor African countries, especially with the loss and damage fund not yet operational? In terms of making sure that both Africa and Europe benefit from this relationship, the first point I want to make is that we need some new directions in this relationship. We should be based on dramatically changed international context, a more balanced review of the benefits accruing, as well as a long-term vision. Geography, politics, and history are very, very important. They play a critical role, and they continue to play a role. But the critical point should be the greatest resource, which is the people. So we need to evolve this relationship such that we have more people-to-people relationship. The relationship is by working together. Both Europe and Africa can face their common challenges. For example, Africa has the youngest continent, while that of Europe is declining. We should think creatively how we can take advantage of this youthful population in Africa. Ultimately, we need enhanced governance and institutional collaboration between state and non-state actors, as well as Africa and the EU stakeholders. But to do this properly, like Diana also measured, policies are very, very important. Africa has to evolve and make sure they're able to come up with policies on the direction they want to go. I also want to suggest that so far, the relationship which has been defined by development cooperation or aid should move beyond that. The provenance of loans and investment in Africa partnership with none other actors like China shows that what can happen if this is embedded within Europe. If you don't mind, the final point I want to make is on critical minerals, because this is very important to Africa. Africa is home to 30% of the world critical minerals, which are needed for the renewable energy technologies, electronics, as well as defense applications. But looking at the history in Africa, we've been afflicted by the resource costs. So how can we make sure we take advantage of new resource form? This is where I think Europe can come in and help Africa in designing both the policies and getting the finance. Because looking at what is happening now, there is no indication that we are not going to go back to the resource cost. Take the example of bauxite, for example. I mean, in its crude form, it fetches just 65 tons. But when processed, it fetches $2,335. And most of these resources are flowing to China. So we need to help Africa in such a way that they can add value and process these resources. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Africana. Thank you so much for that. Tony, let me turn to you. I know we're running very late.
I'll try to keep it snappy.
Please.
But there were a couple of very pertinent questions, and Diana did a great job on the carbon pricing. But allow me, first, on CBAM, I really cannot emphasize it enough. It is a climate instrument. By the way, it is a phased-in instrument. The first 2 years, no money will be reimbursed. It's all about information and learning how the system works so we can tweak it to make it help. By the way, we have a huge outreach by the European Commission to a lot of countries for technical assistance and guidance. And it's transforming markets. As Diana said, countries are thinking their own way of dealing with it. The phase-in will last for years before the full amount is done. And I think the basic premise is if you see this as a protectionism, then the answer is, well, as I said, any country that goes in transition has to redress carbon leakage or we should not have a transition. And that's not the alternative. When it comes to credibility and your question, I understand the question. I also would suggest please read the latest European Council conclusions of last week and the very strict positions we take on a ceasefire, on a lasting peace, on the unacceptability of the attack on UNIFIL, all these issues. And when it comes to credibility, I mean, I understand it. Go around the world and ask others about their credibility. That's going to be a tricky issue. When it comes to repower EU, and somebody else also mentioned it about, I think you also mentioned it first about the diversification and the gas in the short run. It's very important to understand that no one can just turn the switch and say, as of tomorrow, we will just have no energy. We will have no light. All lights will go out. So the premise of the Repower EU was to say, okay, our arc to climate neutrality is still there. We're staying the course. However, in the short run, we'll have to diversify, find gas elsewhere. By the way, paying a pretty good premium, and we're very grateful to our partners, the United States, but also others who've chipped in for the short term. We also said, and you know, coal is the devil, we will extend the lifetime of some coal-fired power plants. I can tell you, we hardly use them. They're going to be phased out before too long. So the bridge is going to be different. The bridge of gas is a transition, and I think the gentleman from Senegal, from United Nations, of course, gas is seen as a transition thing. But for us, we are absolutely going down. Before the war, we had 400 BCM gas that we needed for the whole of the EU. In 2023, that was 300 BCM. We're going down in 2030 to about 150 BCM, and in 2040, we'll be below 50 BCM. So it's very clear we're going down. And then to our gentleman who said, so what is the deal with African nations, or I think maybe it was your question, when we initially went to them for gas and investment in gas now, we said at the same time, we're not here for the short run. Our deal, our offer is, yes, gas now, but we're going to do it in such a way that we're ready for a hydrogen future, and we are here for the long term to have relationship for the long term with you. We're not going to be a low cost, as some powers are. Then when it comes to also Ukraine, it's very interesting. We're organizing a whole conference at COP Baku, how to ensure that even while the war is going on, and even while only 20% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure is still there, which is perilously low as the winter comes in, we're already starting to think, how can we recover and reconstruct an energy system that is sustainable and modern, also with a view to Ukraine at one point becoming an EU member state. So it's super difficult because every time a missile is lobbed and ruins something, we're already thinking on, okay, we have to put and plant and help them set up an energy system that is fit for the future. And finally, when it comes to self-interest, I think let's not be naive. Our politicians in democracies are chosen by their constituents on the basis of a program. That's where their legitimacy is. To think that any country or any nation or any continent in the world would not, or any democracy, would not fight for its self-interest for its own people is really, I don't think that's the right way to look at it. However, the question is, how do you define self-interest? And the way I think we are defining our self-interest is, yes, we want to remain competitive. We want to make sure that we have a fit for the future of, with regards to climate crisis and environment, but we understand we can't do it alone. So for the competitiveness and resilience, and for the same time a future, we need the rest of the world. We need supply chains. We cannot be dependent upon one country, so we need more. Africa's a huge, I mean, Mitaki explained excellent. All the good things also can come from Africa in terms of raw materials, in terms of innovation, products there. So we need the rest of the world. And how do we do it? Well, by the way, as Diana said, we're the biggest global donor in the world with our member states in the EU. That's why we're doing it. That's not because of just the good of our heart, even though we'd like to think that. That is also a defined self-interest. And I think it's really important to say that. So thanks. I hope it was snappy enough.
Thank you. That's fantastic, Tony. And last word to Mitika.
Yeah, so it's difficult to speak at the last, because everything has been spoken. The lady asked about the competition, and I think he has answered it very well. But for the past 2 years, I've heard about the Italy-Africa Summit, Turkey-Africa Summit, EU-Africa Summit, French-Africa Summit, German-Africa Summit, and so forth and so forth. And all these are members, apart from Turkey, are members of European Union. So when you talk about the self-interest then, it is all about really strategic positioning of various countries. Remember, some of them are autonomous entities within the same bloc. And there is nothing wrong in that. But we would, as Africa, want really to see, to work, even EU, whether they are more individualistic. You know, I talked about, we watch this global geopolitical landscape and the rise of a caliber of leadership, which is more inward looking rather than looking at multilateralism. That's the biggest challenge we have in the world. So they don't see the value of a bloc like EU. They would want to move at their own country. So Italy wants to have its own relationship with Africa. German also need to have, yet there is. So we have really to be very honest with each other and look at these things, which is beyond the EU. EU is a bloc, and it has also its own challenges. So that notwithstanding then, how do we work at multilateralism? There are those who do not believe in multilateralism, and they believe on their own, and that's allowed. But so how then do we take advantage of the EU, and despite its challenges, it can't be 100%, and pick what is possible so that we can showcase that it works to work within a broader multilateral framework than working as individual countries. And that is the challenge which we have even at the international climate discourse process, that there are those people, even within the civil society, who do not believe in multilateralism. In fact, most of them say it is a waste of time. They have insulted the UNFCCC process, the COPs, that the COPs are those jamborees to waste time. You spend a lot of money in going to the COPs without, we need really to put that money at the local level without realizing that without multilateralism, we would not be having the Paris Agreement. Yeah. We would not be having the Green Climate Fund. We would not be having the loss and damage fund, the adaptation fund, which benefits smaller countries, which may not have as big a voice compared to the bigger powers if they don't patch together at multilateralism. So multilateralism is very, very important. It safeguards the interests of those small countries, and that's why we come as an African group rather than coming as a Kenyan in the negotiations. Hardly do we hear about us talking about as Kenya. But again, what happens? These main countries which already are just advancing their nationalistic interests, they are more interested in their bilateral, just Kenya, Italy, small $1 billion US, then you just abandon, we don't want you to talk about bigger picture, let us talk about this. Without realizing that climate change goes beyond a boundary, national boundary and even global boundary. There is a level we need to work in collaboration. There is a level we need to safeguard collectively the Amazon. There is a level we need to collectively address the Congo Basin. These are, public goods which do not belong to an individual country nor an individual world, and if they are destroyed, we all suffer. So these are some of the things which brings humanity together, and some of these principles are very important. And so, as we look at our own individual countries, I think we cannot abandon multilateralism. Whether at African level, whether at EU level, and coming together into blocks is very, very important. So I think I need to make that very clear. Then finally, as I think we close, because I'm sure we are not going to get any other opportunity. I said when I was starting, we look at just transition at different levels, and we need to contextualize it within our own local, national, global, and even regional context. Let me give you, and I gave you illustration at the north. In Africa, I mentioned that it is inevitable that we have to transition. All the countries which, including my small Jackie at home, which I use, is a second-hand car from Japan. And looking at the way the world is transitioning, even the north, in 5-10 years' time, that car which I'm driving, it is most likely going to, that I may import. The next import, Japan may not be importing second-hand cars to Africa. It not internal combustion engine cars. They will be exporting electric cars. And what does that tell you? It tells you that we will have to change even our mode of consumption and production, because we don't even produce our own oil for our own domestic consumption. We produce it for export. And so if Japan today, China tomorrow, Europe tomorrow wake up and say, no, we are not taking your oil, are we going to drink it? Yeah. And so what we are doing as the civil society and the climate community and just transition community, what we are doing is really what we are calling constructive engagement with our leaders. We need really to show them that this is not about really EU saying they are not going to take your oil. We are seeing things from far, that this asset is going to be obsolete. And hence, the debate on potentially stranded asset in Africa. President Museveni of Uganda, is developing a 1,443 oil pipeline from Albertine region to Tanga in Tanzania. Remember, that oil pipeline is not Ugandan money. It is borrowed from Shell, BP, and now China. The EU refused. We put pressure into EU, and they said they are not going to fund it. But nevertheless, he has got money. So we are discussing and telling him, this money you are taking, suppose now you develop now, and now you put together that oil pipeline. And all of a sudden, where you want to take that oil, you are told, now we are not going to take that oil. It's not for domestic purpose, so what happens? That oil now, with that investment, with the debt he has taken, with the money he has put into that, becomes a stranded asset. I'm just giving you an example because all that, there are a lot of oil fields, people exploring oil without realizing that this is going to come to be. And so what we are telling our leaders is there used to be a mineral called asbestos. Asbestos used to be a very priced mineral for roofing. But right now, if you go any school in our countries, you find an asbestos building. You have to destroy and bury it very far on the ground because now it's carcinogenic. It causes cancer. Most likely, this coal, all these assets, the oil, may turn out to be another asbestos in many years to come. So it is not really campaign, it is really how do you approach it so that the leaders understand the epoch of time which we are, that we have to do the right thing at the right time. It is the time of transition. We want it or not, we'll transition, but it is difficult. However, we need some of these NDCs, for instance, is conditional on the support from the North, the way we decide our NDCs. We need resources. Our NDCs perhaps cost almost, I think, 280 trillion US dollars. Who is going to provide that? Is it EU? I don't know. So these are things we are going to discuss in Baku. Determining the global financial goal, LCQG, it is not a walk in the park because we are discussing economies, we are discussing money, and when you are discussing money, it is an emotive issue. We hope this is going to pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It has been an absolutely fascinating, I think, conversation. It's very clear that we could have gone on for much longer. I think what this has also really highlighted is that we are, especially those that do have the ambition and conviction to move in this direction, whether in Europe or in Africa, we're far more aligned than what we often assume. I think that we are far better at listening to it, to one another, than again, what is often portrayed. I think this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation, a lot more to discuss. Let us now break. For those who will then be continuing the conversation in the private roundtables, we will be meeting at 1:20 outside here. Okay. And for those of us who joined us today, thank you so much for being here. To be continued. Thank you very much.